Well, hello there and welcome back to our videos on the transport system in humans. So in the last video we looked at this diagram here. We saw how the heart is connected to the lungs as well as how the heart is connected to the rest of the body. We also learned the names of the main blood vessels that connect the heart to the lungs to the heart to the body, and the body back to the heart. Now in this lesson, I'm going to focus a bit more at what happens at the capillaries, because we haven't really looked at that yet. So we're going to start off with the capillaries in the lungs. So I want you to remember that from the heart to the lungs, the pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. And then the pulmonary vein carries the oxygenated blood back from the lungs back to the heart. And between the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary veins, we have the capillaries inside the lungs. So deoxygenated blood will move into the capillaries, and then oxygen will move from the lungs into the capillaries so that the blood inside becomes oxygenated and can be carried back to the heart. So what happens exactly here inside the lungs? What happens in the capillaries inside the lungs? We're going to take a closer look. So here's a diagram of your lungs. Now you have two lungs, one here, and there are many air tubes or air passageways that branch out into your lungs. Now at the end of these branches, so after branching out a lot, at the end of the branches, you'll find these structures called alveoli, or more simply put, they are called air sacs. And these air sacs, or these alveoli, are surrounded by capillaries. So we're going to take a closer look at the alveoli and the capillaries that surround them. So lungs contain structures called alveoli, or air sacs, which are surrounded by capillaries. So here's a diagram of that. And in this diagram, first thing to say is that you see one alveolus. Okay, so alveolus is the singular word. Okay, so one alveolus, and if you have many alveolus, then you get many alveoli. You call it alveoli. So this is an air sac over here, this diagram. You can see that this air sac is made up of a layer of cells. So 1 cell, 2 cell, 3 cells. The cells form a layer to form this air sac. Surrounding the air sac is a capillary. So here's our capillary. And you see the capillary is actually made up of cells as well. So here's the capillary wall made up of cells. And you can see inside the capillary we have our red blood cells. So when air moves in and out of the lungs, it will also move in and out of the alveolus. Okay, so now we're going to look at how gases are exchanged between the alveolus and the capillary. Right, so there are gases, there's air, right, moving in and out of the alveolus, which contains gases, and some of these gases are going to move into the capillary, and some of the gases from the capillary are going to move into the alveolus so that they can be breathed out. How does that happen? Well, the important process is diffusion, as we shall see in a while. So let's think about the blood that enters the capillaries. Right, remember this blood is actually coming from the pulmonary artery. It's coming from the heart to the lungs. So the blood that comes from the pulmonary artery is oxygen poor. So blood entering these capillaries has a very high concentration of carbon dioxide and a low concentration of oxygen. Now what happens is that carbon dioxide will then diffuse from the capillaries into the lungs. Why? Right, because there's a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the capillaries compared to the concentration of carbon dioxide inside the alveolus. Next, oxygen will also diffuse from the alveolus, from the lung, into the bloodstream, into the capillary. Why? Because there's a higher concentration of oxygen inside the alveolus compared to the lower concentration of oxygen inside the capillaries. So after the oxygen diffuses into the capillaries, then the blood leaving the capillaries has a high concentration of oxygen and a low concentration of carbon dioxide. And now we are ready to go back to the heart. So now this blood that leaves the capillaries, which is high in oxygen, all the capillaries will join back together to form the pulmonary vein, and the blood will be brought back to the heart. So let's just do a bit of practice. Here's a diagram on your notes. I want you to draw the oxygen molecules representing them with a circle, and so you can draw more circles where the oxygen concentration is higher and fewer circles where the oxygen concentration is lower. Then I want you to draw an arrow to show the direction in which the oxygen diffuses. So here in the diagram you see that this is the air that's just inhaled, that's just been breathed into the lungs. Alright, pause the video and then play again when you're done trying. Alright, so I hope we've tried. So the air that enters the lungs, that's inhaled into the lungs, actually has quite a high concentration of oxygen compared to the concentration of oxygen that's in the blood that has just entered the capillaries. Remember, this blood that's coming to the capillaries comes from the heart. So it's very low in oxygen. So as a result, oxygen will move by diffusion from the lungs, from the alveolus, into the capillary. Now, I would like you to do the same practice, but this time to show the movement of carbon dioxide, and you can use a square to represent carbon dioxide molecules. So once again, pause the video here and play again once you're done trying. Okay, so this time we should have drawn something like this. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood capillary is a lot higher compared to the concentration of carbon dioxide inside the lungs. But that's because the blood that enters the capillaries, which comes from the heart, has a very high concentration of carbon dioxide. So as a result, carbon dioxide will move by diffusion from the blood capillaries into the lungs, and then that carbon dioxide will be exhaled out of the lungs. So that's when we breathe out, and all the carbon dioxide comes out from our lungs. Alright, so we've looked at what happens in the capillaries inside the lungs. In the capillaries inside the lungs, right, oxygen moves from the lungs into the capillaries, oxygen, I'll just write O2, and carbon dioxide moves out of the capillaries, so CO2, moves out of the capillaries into the lungs. Now what happens in the body's capillaries? So now we're going to take a look at the capillaries near the body tissue cells. So this could be anything like your muscle tissue, it could be your brain tissue, it could be your stomach tissue. Right? This is just a body. The word body represents all these possible tissues. So what happens in the capillaries here? We saw in the previous video that the heart will pump out blood through the aorta, right? Oxygenated blood into the body. And then the aorta will branch out to form many capillaries in the body. Now in those capillaries, there's exchange of substances with the tissue cells that surround it. So this time, because there's a lot of oxygen in the capillaries, oxygen will actually move out from the capillaries to the tissue. So it gives the muscle and brain and the stomach oxygen that it needs. And then carbon dioxide will actually diffuse from the muscle cells, from the body cells, and the brain cells, and the stomach cells, all the different body cells. Carbon dioxide will actually diffuse back from them into the capillaries. Right? So the body's tissue cells are getting rid of the carbon dioxide, so it's moving into the capillaries. So that the blood that leaves the body, right, all these capillaries now have very little oxygen. Right? They'll join back together to form the vein called the vena cava, and it'll carry the deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So for the rest of this video, we're going to take a closer look at what happens in the capillaries in the body. So take note of the diagram. It looks a bit different from the lung one, right? So when you see the capillaries in the lungs, you'll normally see the air sac, right? And then you see the capillaries that surround it. Or you'll mention in the question that it's about the lung capillaries. But if you see a diagram that looks something like this, usually it represents the capillaries in the rest of the body because there's no air sac. There's no alveoli there to represent the lungs. Okay, so here's our diagram. Alright, this is the blood capillary over here. You can see the capillary walls made up of these cells. These two are the capillary walls. And then you can see the cells inside the capillary. There's a red blood cell, and here's a white blood cell. And here are the tissue cells. So once again, this could be anything like your muscle tissue or your brain tissue. So the tissue cells are quite close to the capillaries, and that's why substances can be exchanged between the blood in the blood capillaries and the tissue cells. And the function of capillaries is to allow the substances to be exchanged between the blood and the tissue cells. So at the capillaries, useful substances like oxygen and nutrients will move from the blood capillaries to tissue cells by diffusion. So here's the useful substances. Okay, let's say there's a lot of oxygen in the blood. It will move by diffusion from the blood into the tissue cells to provide them with the oxygen that they need to carry out their activities. And on the other hand, right, the waste products like carbon dioxide, so all these tissue cells here will, they produce a lot of carbon dioxide after going through all their activities. All these waste substances will move from the tissue cells into the blood capillaries by diffusion. And then these capillaries will then join back together to form the vena cava. So the vena cava will be very rich in waste substances like carbon dioxide. So it goes back to the heart, and then the heart will pump out these waste products like carbon dioxide to the lungs to be removed. Now, one interesting fact to note is that capillaries have walls that are 1 cell thick. So you can see over here, the capillary wall is just made up of 1 layer of cells. Each one of this is 1 cell, 2 cell, 3 cell, 4 cell, and they are joining up together to just form 1 layer. Now the capillary walls are just 1 cell thick, so that there's a faster rate of diffusion because the distance for diffusion is very short. Imagine if the capillary walls were much thicker. So imagine if they're made out of 3 or 4 cells. I'm just trying to draw. Imagine if it was a lot thicker, then the substances need to diffuse through more layers before they can reach the blood. So because capillary walls are only 1 cell thick, there's a faster rate of diffusion because the distance for diffusion is shorter. Okay, so just a quick check before we end this video. Try out these 2 questions. So the answer is that the concentration of oxygen is higher inside the capillaries compared to the body cells. So it will move from the capillaries to the body cells to give them oxygen. And the concentration of oxygen should be lower in the capillaries compared to the lungs, so that the oxygen will move from the lungs into the capillaries. Alright, that's all for this lesson. See you back in class.